Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. It's a very special edition this week because I'm talking to a man who has spent his whole adult life, and perhaps longer, trying to make the world a better place as a volunteer, giving public service to all sorts of causes, but also as an iconic award-winning journalist. He also happens to be the man who I have sat across the desk from for the last 23 years as the main presenter of Channel 4 News. Jon, it's really funny sitting here because we presented our last programme together last night. But I want to spend today understanding your values and what really has driven you through the last 50 years or so. So let's start with where your values come from. I mean, most people say parents. Would you say the same?
Yeah, I would say parents, yes, even though I disagreed with them on a lot of things. I was in a privileged family, without any question. My father's father was a knighted general. He had led the retreat from Mons in the First World War, and long before that, he went to the relief of Khartoum, and he was a celebrated guy. And my father when I was born, was the headmaster of a rather minor private school called Ardingly. The great advantage of the place was it was set in the most heavenly circumstances, lovely oak woodlands and the rest in the middle of Sussex. And the view from my bedroom window was crowned by a viaduct, long viaduct on the London-Brighton line. And from these very privileged windows, we saw the trains going through.
But your sense of right and wrong, where does that emerge?
I don't know. I mean, I think...
Is it Church of England, or is it...
It's not Church of England, I don't think, really. Except I was a chorister and all the rest of it, spent a lot of time in cathedrals and churches. I suppose some of it must have come from my parents, but I disagreed with them politically. Considerably. So it's very hard to know where these things really come from. There were various conventions in the class in which I grew up. For example, that you would volunteer and VSO, voluntary service overseas. There were all sorts of values that were imposed, like it or not. And I think my values only really became clear in my late teens.
So were you a rebel by that stage?
I don't think I was yet a rebel. I mean, I went to a public school in Oxford. I rebelled to some extent there, ran a rather cheeky, radical little newspaper. It wasn't really a newspaper, a rag paper. And possibly I was a bit rebellious then, yes, beginning.
Hippie? Were you
Not
a hippie?
hippie, no, never did drugs or anything like that.
When you say you politically disagreed with them,
Yeah.
Was there ever a world in which that's what you wanted to do? You wanted to be a politician to change the world?
Yes, the idea of being a politician crossed my mind. But the journey to becoming a politician is a very odd one, very peculiar, really, in the end. And somehow I never got down to it.
Because you came across these people, didn't you? Because of
Yes,
parents.
I did.
You met the Prime Minister very early on in life.
Well, it was quite extraordinary. I mean, there was, as in all these public schools, there was a big chapel. And we used to go there on Sundays. And my mother and my father would be officiating because he was ordained and all that. And a funny and extremely unhappy-looking man came and sat at the other end of our pew. And I asked my father later who he was. He said that's somebody called Harold Macmillan, and he's the Prime Minister. And indeed, the next Sunday, he introduced me. And he said, do you know what a Prime Minister is, young man? I said, are you married to the Queen? Which seemed to me the logical thing. They seemed to be the most famous couple going. He said, no. I'm the Prime Minister and I run the country. Just like that.
So were you sort of part of that class of people who were raised to make the world a better place? You had to do your part. You had to do something. What were the expectations on you?
No, I think that was part of the part of the plan. I think my father was very disappointed I was quite so thick. I got very poor exam results, poor A-levels, a C, a D, and an E. I think he wrote me off as a bit of a fool. I had two brothers, one younger, one older, and both were infinitely brighter than I was.
But you see, this has been your shtick for as long as I've known you, that you're not bright enough to be anything other than a great television presenter. You know, it's a great skill as a journalist, not to be too clever. It's not true, really.
Well, it's not precisely true, no. That is also true. But, I mean, I was not academically brilliant, and that wasn't the way my intellect worked. I was really good with people.
Yeah, and curious.
Very curious, and I loved talking to people. I loved exploring things.
What did you think you were going to do when you were a teenager?
I hadn't a clue. I could sing, I could play the piano, but my academic life was pretty challenged.
So your sort of first then massive step is to go to Uganda.
Yes, I applied for voluntary service overseas, and I was picked. Probably because I had a posh accent, I don't know.
So why did you apply? I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary thing to do, isn't it?
I needed something to take me out of where I was. I had a reasonable spirit of adventure, but it was very domestically located. And I really wanted to explore. And the great thing about VSO was that you had no idea where on earth they would send you. And I applied and I was accepted. And they said I was to go to Uganda. I mean, I'd barely heard of it, let alone knew where it was. So this was a voyage into the unknown.
And in the course of that and your work there, were you starting to think about the future and the world? And were you starting to put things together at all?
I was. I mean, obviously, never really having traveled, I don't think I'd ever even been abroad before. No, really. It's hard to imagine. But, I got on the VC-10 and arrived at Entebbe. And I had no idea what I was going to run into. And what I ran into was massive responsibility. A school of 400 or 500 kids from a culture that I knew nothing of an ethnicity I'd barely ever met, on the banks of the Nile, very romantic setting. It was an old shipbuilding yard that had been converted into a school. It was run by priests, Catholic priests. I was a Protestant, which was a black mark for me, but there we were. And I absolutely relished it, loved every second of it. And then obviously while you were there, you could travel around East Africa and see the world. I mean, it just completely lit my bonfire.
And presumably see deep inequality and poverty at the same time.
Definitely.
And that must have lit a fire in you.
The inequality has been something that has really been part of my kind of approach to society, though I'm obviously on the lucky side of the inequality.
But it must have been so far away from your personal experience, seeing poverty in East Africa in the 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very hard to imagine what it must have been like. I mean, it must have been a shock.
Well, it wasn't really. What it was a very fast-flowing education. I was learning every minute of the day about things which I had never had any beginnings of an understanding of. It was a very multicultural experience and multi-religious too.
Can I just rewind it a little? Because you often talk about your father because he had the sort of the job and the bishop and all of that.
Well, he was 8 foot in a mitre.
We don't hear much about your mother.
My mother, I was really quite close to. She was a pianist, a really very accomplished pianist. But she had a very tragic event in her life, which was that she contracted alopecia totalis in her teens and lost all her hair, and it never came back. And I mean, that, for somebody who was heading for public performance, was an absolutely crippling disaster. And I was close to my mother. I felt for her. I mean, it was incredible. My father was so unbelievably insensitive to her condition. We had an open Hodgson Terraplane 8 exhibited in the American Motor Show in 1930. And he would insist on driving around with the hood down. And she, poor woman, had this wig and lashed down with a Jack Ma scarf, desperately trying to hang on to her hair as he hurtled his way around Britain in this ridiculous car, conditioned to grow up. And she needed some sort of support. And I think because we had music together, that she taught me the piano, really encouraged my singing, which led, of course, to being a chorister in Winchester Cathedral. And so I was close to her.
So you have portrayed yourself as this sort of child of, rather well-to-do establishment England. But you've also always portrayed yourself here as the most anti-establishment person you know.
Well, I've never portrayed myself as anything.
You have
I
been.
just
Maybe
am
not portrayed.
whatever I am.
You are, yeah.
I am whatever I am. And I do find it difficult to cope with, I would have said, ill-deserved privilege. And I think that that's one of the things which leads to inequality on some scale.
So have you always felt a little bit guilty?
Not guilty, no. No, I haven't.
About the privilege?
No. I've recognised it. But there's no good being guilty about something you do nothing about. I was born into those circumstances and I did the very best I could with them and used them. I used the contacts, I used the accent. All of them played a good part in securing opportunity for some people who had a much worse deal than I ever did.
But your approach to the establishment as a journalist has been to stick it up them, isn't it?
I don't think so entirely, no. I mean, I've had some good relationships with people in the establishment.
No, I think that's right, in that you make establishment England feel very comfortable because you appear to be one of them, but you're not really intellectually.
Well, I think I make them feel a bit uncomfortable. He's one of us, and he's behaving like a banana
because you're having a go and you're poking them.
No, why not? I mean, if they speak my tongue, let's have a go at seeing how they feel about it.
So where did that come from? When did you decide you wanted to start poking it?
I think I was informed particularly by the experience on VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, unquestionably. I think to be in a country of such poverty, such shortage of opportunity, was a wake-up call. Absolute.
Why were you not a racist? Because so many of your contemporaries would have been.
Well, I think VSO ensured that I wasn't a racist. I mean...
But you can't have been any... You didn't have a racist reaction to going to Uganda, did you?
But I mean, how could you sort of put yourself up to go and live with an ethnic minority and hate them? Not a chance, not a chance. And living with them was an incredible education.
Did you do you remember people saying things around you, or the attitudes of the time that you found objectionable?
I think that came later. I don't think... I was a slow developer, a late developer and a slow developer.
What do you mean it came later?
I think when I went to university in Liverpool, I really did then begin to encounter...
Racism?
Yeah, well, not only racism, but really acute inequality. And of course, the people at the bottom of inequality tended to be ethnic minorities.
Did you identify with them? Or did you think this was wrong? Well, I'm trying to work out your reaction to it.
No, I think wrong was a better description. I thought it was wrong. I thought that there was no way that life was designed to have those sort of divisions and a sort of impenetrable order that meant these people were there and those people were there.
I mean, you mentioned university, and your university life is very well charted and known, and how you had to leave Liverpool University because of your anti-apartheid protests.
Well, it was a rather difficult problem because the Chancellor of the university was Lord Salisbury, who had very controversial views about race. and we found fault with them.
Did you have any sense of what was at stake for you when
Not
you were
a
doing
clue.
those protests?
Not a clue.
You didn't think for a minute you'd be sent down?
No, not a chance. I mean, we had lots of open debates and all the rest of it, marches and this, that, and the other. But the fact that, because I had a public school accent, when Lord Salisbury decided to come and visit the university, I was sent to the railway station in Liverpool to meet him off the train and tell him that, to be honest, he wouldn't be welcome. And he said, oh, very well, I'm going to return home and I shall never come here again. And that was the end of his tenure as Chancellor, but it was also the end of my university career.
But for what crime did they get rid of you? What was it you'd done?
Bringing the university into disrepute.
And then they honoured you afterwards, didn't they?
They did, yes. Yeah, it's true.
But before you come into journalism, you again are volunteering. So you get involved in Lord Longford's
I was
day
paid.
centre.
Paid a salary.
Oh, you were paid, okay.
Well,
Wasn't entirely selfless.
I was the boss of the day centre.
Right. So tell me about that. Why were you doing it?
Well, I obviously had to redeem myself. I mean, I wasn't getting anywhere unless I did something which counterbalanced being thrown out of university. And I got this job in Covent Garden when it was still a fruit market. And we had a day centre for homeless and vulnerable teenagers. And heaven knows why they appointed me, but I think they thought being thrown out of university was actually a qualification, that perhaps I'd identify with homeless people more easily. Maybe I did.
But you did. That's the truth, isn't it?
Who knows? And I did very much develop the place, and I built it up from 3 of us to some 20 people working there, and it became quite a big project. And it's still a big project. It was amazing work because you could make a difference, unquestionably.
And it was something that you kept going, or having a role in, for decades on.
Yeah, I was on the governing council after I left.
Because a lot of people would do something like that and then just move on and sort of get on with the rest of their lives.
Well,
But you've not been able to do that, have you? You carry these things with you.
Well, but only because I transitioned from a voluntary project to broadcasting, and I realised that I could use the one to assist the other. I mean, if you could publicise what was going on or use your talents as a broadcaster in their interests, you can make another contribution without having to slog through the day trying to sort out their emotional turmoil.
And what were you able to do for them as a broadcaster?
Well, as a broadcaster, I mean, I could help them raise money. I had a profile. I could use it, and I did some radio appeals and that sort of thing.
But you've been quite modest with what you've achieved there, haven't you, I think?
Oh, I don't think so. I think I've been bragging a bit.
What do you think you got from those interactions with people?
Redemption. Well, I went there a scoundrel and ended up a saint.
So when you come to ITN, how did that happen?
Well, I resisted coming to ITN because my cousin Peter Snow had been here. So I really did resist quite extensively. I thought if I'm going to do it, I won't do it at ITN.
But why did you want to be a journalist? At what point?
Because I then saw that there was another mechanism for wrestling with inequality, and that was broadcasting. I tried patching up the problems on the street, but I realised that strategically, what you really needed was to be in the purveyor of information industry.
See, people will listen to that and they'll go, so he always had an agenda.
No, I never had an agenda, but I had an attitude. And the attitude was that, not all that glitters is not gold, and that, undeserved privilege is not a good idea, and that poverty isn't a good idea either.
So what did you want to do as a journalist? What was your ambition?
Well, more than anything, to retrieve and report truth, which is quite a challenge as a hack.
But it's basically what you've been doing ever since.
Yeah, well, it's very rewarding. It's very varied. You never have the same day twice. Every single day I've ever worked in the 45 odd years that I've been a journalist has been different every single day. And you never know what's going to happen during the course of that day.
What have you seen as your role in public life in this democracy? Without sounding sort of too pompous about it all, it's an important role.
I see myself as an informant. That's my job, tell the truth and see where it takes us.
But if you break that down, that involves sort of sometimes revealing things that people don't know.
Yes.
Things like the government's legal advice to go to war in Iraq, which you were very involved in, and also holding the government to account in interviews.
True.
So tell me about the legal advice. What was driving you in that? Because I remember you during that period, and you were sort of a dog with a bone.
Do you think so?
Yeah. Yeah, you were absolutely determined.
Well, it seemed to me that there was only one thing to do, and that was to inspect this at every element and just decide to what extent the government's action was justified, legally, and in every other way, morally as well. Why not?
And when you were interrogating them, what was in your mind?
Is he telling the truth? Because it would be he, rarely she.
Is that true generally then with politicians? I mean, is that what's in your mind? I mean, or is that a sort of a more modern problem?
Well, I think if you're involved in the business of news, it's a good idea to ensure that what you're reporting is true.
But how do you think that's changed? Sort of the interaction between you as an interviewer and politicians? Because I think it's even changed in the course of my career. It must have changed.
It has changed hugely. It's changed partly because class has mellowed to some extent. It's still there very much, but it's nothing like what it was. The automaticity of anybody who spoke with the Queen's English would be, better off than anybody else in every respect. They would be respected and they would be trusted, when very often they were scoundrels.
But also their willingness to face scrutiny has changed, hasn't it? I mean, even 15 years ago, facing scrutiny, facing a grilling on Channel 4 News or on Newsnight or the Today programme was part of being a cabinet minister. Part of the job. You had to defend your patch.
Yeah.
And if you couldn't defend your patch, then what were you doing in the job? That's changed.
Well, it has. There's much more evasion now. There are elements of the political system that never give an account of themselves other than to each other and don't make themselves available to the press or anybody else.
And why do you think that is?
Maybe because they don't like having to give that sort of an account. They can do it more easily in Parliament.
And how do you feel about them? Has the way you feel about the establishment changed at all during this period?
You mean now that I'm part of it?
Well, no, I mean, you've, as I say, you spent 50 years kind of poking the establishment and revealing things about it and challenging it. And I just wonder sort of what your perspective is on it now.
Well, I'm fully aware that I'm a member of the establishment without any question. You couldn't pretend that you were appearing nightly pontificating on Channel 4 News if you didn't expect to be regarded as part of the establishment. There are lots of people out there who think, in fact, we're,
part of the problem.
Part of the problem, who knows? Of all sorts of different persuasions, left and right. I mean, I think that's the big change, is that evasion has also set in that people don't really want to be held to account too closely by a lot of hacks.
So when you look at sort of the industry now, do you think it's still working as a way of holding power to account?
I do, yeah. I do.
So you don't feel that we're sort of being sort of disempowered in any way?
No, I don't.
By the reluctance of politicians to face scrutiny?
Well, that's a kind of disempowerment, but that's disempowering the electorate, not disempowering the press. I mean, who cares if the press can't get to an MP? The question is what it's doing to the political system.
So let's just rewind over some of your sort of your very famous moments, if you like. South Africa and your relationship with South Africa.
Yeah.
is obviously a huge part of your career because it predates journalism, and then you have covered South Africa through your career and interviewed Mandela. How do you place that in your life?
Well, I mean, the importance of it was born in doing voluntary service overseas in Uganda. I think the privilege of living as an ethnic minority and looking at the world from the view of the majority gives you an insight into the way matters are set.
But the sense of injustice that you felt as a student protesting about apartheid was something you then saw unravel as a journalist.
I did. I can't say I played any part in it, but I mean, I certainly witnessed it and reported it.
How did it feel?
Exhilarating. Change is exhilarating.
So how did it feel then to sit down with Mandela? Tell me about how you got the Mandela interview, because it's kind of it's a matter of discussion, isn't it? So exactly how it happened.
Well, I just kept persisting. I mean, I just made sure that I talked to everybody that I could possibly talk to that had any influence and might ensure that I could get it. I don't actually even remember exactly how I did get it. And it was a wonderful, extraordinary, uplifting experience. You know, he was as good as they said he was. You know, he was modest, he was simple and straightforward, and yet, you know, a very clear and imaginative thinker.
How were you able to keep your head interviewing Mandela, given everything that had gone before for you personally?
I think because of the way he was, himself having been in prison, he had a way with meeting people and understanding them and talking to them, whatever their station. He didn't stand on any ceremony at all. It was therefore extraordinarily easy to relate to him. He made it easy. And that was really, I think, why he was regarded with such affection and respect. He actually treated people as he expected to be treated himself.
Is there something of that?
I mean, so often you interview somebody you've been told is, oh, he's a very nice, clever guy. And actually, in fact, they're terribly disappointing. There was nothing disappointing about Nelson Mandela. Nothing. Not one iota of it.
When you look back at your pieces, do you think, I kind of got it right?
I actually never look back.
Well, when you're forced
very
to,
rarely.
On these sorts of occasions.
Yeah, on these sort of occasions, I'm usually reasonably relieved.
More than relieved, presumably. I mean, I think you look back at those pieces and you think it's really quite impressive.
Well, I was yesterday looking at the lifeboat disaster in Mosul in Cornwall, not something many people now remember, except, of course, the poor people of Mosul. And I accept that it was a really beautiful, sensitive piece. This was a lifeboat crew going to the rescue of people on a larger boat, which then fell on the lifeboat, and everybody was killed. And it devastated, it decimated a community. I was amazed that it was as sensitive a piece as it was.
You see, I mean, I think the line again that draws through your pieces and your journalism is humanity, empathy, warmth. These are the things people always say about Jon Snow journalism.
Well, but I'm terribly lucky because I was exposed to experiences which were bound to have that effect on you.
It was just a human reaction.
Yeah.
So what would you advise younger journalists who will look on all of this and think about all of these things as to how they should approach their jobs and the things they report on?
I think they have to let themselves change and let themselves grow and embrace thoughts, ideas, and cares that you never expected to use. Use all your gifts, all your sensitivities. Don't blunder in like some bulldozer. You know, these people need to be loved if they're going to talk to you. If you're going to understand who they are and what they're suffering or what their aspirations are.
Because it's quite the opposite to what a lot of people do, which is go into a situation and basically switch themselves off.
No, definitely.
And sort of detach themselves from the story because they've got to report it. You've always done quite the opposite.
Yeah, but one does have to be wary of one's emotions. And I may have been over-emotional in my reporting. I don't know, but I don't regret it.
Well, I don't think if you look back at your reporting, there's anything over-emotional about it.
I mean, I've cried sometimes when writing a script.
What it is you're thinking about or being forced to think about.
What it makes me think about, yeah.
Because what's really interesting, I think, is throughout all this sensitivity that you talk about, as a television presenter, you have to be an ego. As the star of the show, you also have to be quite self-centered and want to be loved. So how do these two things go together?
Well,
the egotism of being of a television presenter with the sensitivity of you as a human being.
Well, I don't want to be loved. I'm certainly not asking for that. But I don't think it's inconsistent. I think it's all part of the parcel.
But it's true, isn't it? To be on screen, you've got to be a performer and you've got to enjoy the attention.
You've got to accept the attention. You don't necessarily have to enjoy it, but you have to accept it and use it. You have a responsibility. People are looking to you for truth and for information and sometimes for emotion too.
Do you like being the centre of attention?
Not particularly. I don't think I am the centre of attention. And it's my job actually to make what I'm talking about the centre of attention.
I just want to ask you about Grenfell as well then, as a more recent story which you stamped yourself all over and then spoke about very eloquently at Edinburgh. It was as though Grenfell, when it happened, opened your eyes again to something new, which was related to the inequality and the racism that you reported on all your life. What happened there?
It seemed to be so much about our age right now. Here was a block that to the ill-informed eye would be, you'd say, oh, well, it's perfectly safe. It's sort of recently built and it's, I'm sure it's got all the protections and the rest of it. Well, of course it hadn't. And that was actually an awful shock that there were thousands of people across the country living in blocks just like Grenfell, and there still are. And it had all the inadequacies that we now know about, but we didn't know about when we were sent there to report.
What kind of effect do you think that had on you?
I found it very, very distressing. And I think one would not be reflecting the truth if you did not confess to that reality. Viewers don't want you pretending that it doesn't mean anything to you. It meant a very great deal to me. I felt this was a great iniquity that people had been posted up the top of that building, and should a fire break out, had every likelihood they would not survive it.
Because you gave this speech at Edinburgh with a lot of challenges to journalists to rethink the way that we think about these things, cover these things, the attention we give. I mean, do you feel we have risen to it at all as an industry since you put out that challenge, or do you think we still fail?
Well, I don't think we can speak we collectively, but I think there's no doubt that some people in our industry have. I think there's been some wonderful reporting since.
And when you think about what makes you annoyed or angry these days, is it basically the same thing?
I think it is. It is. I mean, I can't deny that I live a comfortable life, but that, I think, if anything, makes me even more aware of how unequal the whole thing is. And then if you cast back to your roots and you think about the kids coming into that day centre in Covent Garden, you feel there's still an enormous amount of work to do to give our people a better life.
Do you wake up with a bee in your bonnet? Do you wake up being annoyed about things?
I never
things that
wake
you want
up-
to tackle?
I never wake up with a bee in my bonnet, and I never wake up, with great sort of worthy thoughts, no.
Well, where do they come from then? Because you're always on the phone in the morning. with an idea?
Oh, well,
You're always talking in the morning meeting. You always have thoughts. You always have things to say. So they must erupt somewhere.
No, that's called radio 4-itis. I think if you listen to news...
No, you're talking yourself down again. I don't believe that.
I think if you listen to news and current affairs when you wake up in the morning, nothing special about me. I think lots of people listen to things and they hear them and it sparks something in them. Some of them are in a job where they can make a difference and do something. And some of them really want to support people who do that.
And do you think it's important to keep that anger in your mind, if you like, the sense of injustice? Maybe anger's the wrong word.
I don't think you'll ever get rid of it until it, as an issue, is got rid of. And that'll never happen either. So I don't think about it.
My dad's 88 and still working. You're 74, is that right?
Don't rub it in.
Do you think you will carry on forever? Doing these things?
In some form.
Pursuing these things?
In some form, yes. Yeah. I enjoy it. I find it fulfilling. And it brings me a certain kind of joy.
There's not another way that you want to start tackling these things now.
You mean become a vicar or something?
Well, there are all sorts of things you could have. I mean, you could have stood for Parliament this year, couldn't you? You could have taken on that old Owen Paterson seat or something like that. There are all sorts of ways you could decide to tackle things differently.
I don't think a conventional political party would have me.
Is it too late for politics for you?
I think probably, don't you?
Well, I don't know. What about public appointments or, running something or running a university? Or,
no.
None of those things appeal.
No. I don't have the brains.
You certainly do. The whole I don't have the brains thing is just nonsense.
Just check my A-levels.
So final thoughts. Again, I want you to talk to sort of young journalists who are sort of setting out on their path. What would you, having done this for decades now, say to young journalists about what they should keep in mind when they're setting out on their careers?
More than anything, remain yourself, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, and keep your emotions alive. And if you're struck by what you see, you hear, or you feel, explore it.
And do you think you will have changed the world in some way if you stick to these ideas? In all modesty, I don't mean you right now, but I mean, if you do these things, will you make an impact? Is this life a worthwhile life that will make an impact on the world?
It's a worthwhile life. You affect individuals. Sometimes you affect a crowd. But we're needed. Humanity needs us.
So you won't say this about yourself, but I have no doubt that you have changed the world in all sorts of ways, whether it is in things like the legal advice or reporting something with humanity or giving somebody a voice. These things do make a difference. I know you're too modest to say so yourself. No. But if you could just change the world anyway, what would you do?
I think every society has to look to itself and see whether it is giving everybody the best chance they could ever have. I mean, that must be our ambition. It's no good keeping it for a few and using the many to stoke it. Somehow, we have to be alert and use what we see and what we hear, to the benefit of the community we're serving.
And when you look at your new baby boy, are you hopeful for his generation?
That's a big question, isn't it? It's a big question. Hopeful. I think we're going in the right direction. We're talking about it.
Jon Snow, thank you very much indeed for sharing your ways to change the world. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. It's very odd having a conversation like this with somebody you sat next to for so long. But it's been a great pleasure. Our producer is Nina Hodgson. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time,